Religious language. This topic typically sits in the Year 13 side of the course as the first topic that often is taught. Within it also is the symposium debate between Anthony Flew, Richard Hare and Basil Mitchell. You can click on my other two videos which go into great depth and detail analysing those set texts. The purpose of this presentation is to focus on the key concepts and arguments within the topic of religious language. There are three sections to it. The first is analogy and symbol. The second is the verification and falsification debates. And the third is language game theory. It's worth pointing out here at this point that religious language as a topic is not seeking to prove the existence of God like earlier topics and the arguments for the existence of God are. What it seeks to do is to debate whether you can talk meaningfully or not about God. So let's have a look at analogy and symbol. These are alternative ways of discussing the meaningfulness of God. First, let's understand what an analogy is. By definition, an analogy is the use of comparison between two dissimilar or similar things towards the end of explaining a separate concept. This is one of the methods that's used to try and explain belief in God. Here is an example of an analogy. Life is like a box of chocolates. And you never know what you're going to get. Now, on the one hand, you are a human being, and this is a box of chocolates, so you're not the same thing. However, in the same way that when you open a box of chocolates, you may not know what is inside until you open it and find out, and there's a surprise waiting for you. Your life can be very similar to that idea, that you never quite can predict what's just about to happen next or around the corner. Therefore, a box of chocolates and your life can actually find a common ground. And this is an analogy. Aristotle, the well-known Greek philosopher, a student of Plato, who in particular influenced Aquinas, who we're going to look at next, had a theory about analogy. And it was that if two things share a common attribute, then what may be true for one of the pair is true for the other. They share in this common attribute. And he gives four criteria about an analogy. He says, firstly, the strength of an analogy depends on how similar the two things that are being compared are. The second thing is that he argues similarities within the analogies can be found only in things which have the same properties. He says that a sound analogy has a strong common denominator, and that good arguments or analogies don't rely on assumed knowledge regarding that common denominator. Now, at this stage, it's worth pointing out that we're going to see how Aquinas a bit later on attempts to take common attributes that we as humans experience with God as well in the mix, and comparing those attributes, finding some common denominator. So the work of Aristotle here clearly influences the likes of Aquinas. And here Aquinas is, and he has three ways of talking about God. We know that his influence from Aristotle is paramount in the work that he has produced. We see this in the cosmological argument when Aquinas draws upon Aristotle's prime mover idea to talk about the first mover or the unmoved mover. But here he's got three ways of talking about God. The first is using univocal language. And this is when language, words, have the same meaning regardless of the context. If, for example, your parent instructed you to be home by 10 p.m. and that was your curfew, there is simply no room for any other meaning because they've made it absolutely clear. It's 10 p.m. There is no other meaning for 10 p.m. that you would be able to use. And so there's no doubt at all. There are many religious people that use language for God as if it were univocal. They believe when they're saying something like God is love, that has one meaning, regardless of any other context in which it's used. And there is a problem with claiming a clarity around the same meaning when using language for God. And that's because the language that we use is through the eyes of a human lens. So when we say God is love, we're walking into a problem because love can mean many things for many different people. So there's an issue here with God's transcendence, because that attribute of God, his transcendence, being outside of time and space, is in jeopardy when we have a human interpretation of the language that we use, the words that we speak about God. The second way of talking about God is equivocal language. And this is when the words that you use will change their meaning depending on the context in which they're used. Take the word love again, for example. Now, if I said to my best friend, "I love you, man," well, that has a very different meaning than if I said that to my partner, "I love you." You see, there's two very different contexts. If it kept the same meaning, that would be rather worrying, especially for my best friend. Here, when we apply equivocal language to God, again, God loves, God is love, there's such an ambiguous understanding there of what we're saying. It's not clear whatsoever, and it's implying that we are completely different. Whereas univocal language is implying that we're completely the same as God. For Aquinas, he rejects both of these ways of talking about God. He opts for analogous language. And this is, as we've said, comparing two things to explain a separate concept. So let's have a look at Aquinas' understanding of analogy and how he made sense of it when talking about God. The first is to go to his analogy of attribution. He said that the made and the maker, so the creation and the creator, must have commonalities. And we can ascertain things about the maker by looking at what he has made. Just to pause here, this is a good, clear reason why he rejects equivocal language, because he says that there must be commonalities. And equivocal language implies that we're completely distinct and separate. This concept so far as well falls very nicely into what we know of Aquinas from earlier arguments. We know that he's into natural theology. We know that Aquinas wants to use things from the observable world. He uses a posteriori knowledge in his arguments, remember. And so it would make sense here for him to use analogies by looking at what the Creator has created to learn something about him. Now, the example that he gives here, his analogy of attribution, is to look at the urine of a bull. He says that it can tell you, when you analyze the urine of the bull, a lot about the bull's health. But it does not mean that the bull is just urine. If we're looking to things of this world to understand God, they can tell us a lot about God, but it doesn't mean that it is God, because God is the creator and this is the created. So attributing things that have commonalities helps us understand something of the maker. Another common analogy that's often used is the bread and the baker. If you were to taste the bread that has been made, and let's say it gives you a really nice taste in your mouth, and the smell of it is what seems to be divine. It would tell you a lot about the baker. It would tell you that they're a really clever baker, that they're really good at making bread. But you wouldn't go so far as to say, therefore, well, the bread is the baker. So let's have a look at what else Aquinas talks about. He also discusses the analogy of proportionality, and this is very important because without it, you are left attributing earthly things to a transcendent being like God, and at the risk of anthropomorphizing him. So this is an analogy that uses the same word to describe two different things, but the word is used in a different sense. It's used to a different proportion. Now this is important, and also why Aquinas rejects univocal language, because we are not the same as God. And so it's important to make this distinction. So an analogy that can be used here: that dog is a good pet, and that girl is a good person. Now it uses the same word good, both of those two sentences. But the girl is a human, and she is capable of being good, but to a much higher extent than the dog. Now, when we apply this idea of proportionality to God, it helps us make the distinction, but keep the use of the analogy. In the same way that the girl is good in proportion to being a human, and the dog is good in proportion in so much as that he is a dog. The same applies when we say something like, God loves us. It's like when Adam loves Eve. But we can clearly make it obvious here that the nature of God's love is infinitely higher than the nature of the love that Adam had for Eve. Therefore, the word love is used, but in the first context, it's used to a lesser degree than the latter context. Therefore, God's love is proportionately higher than the love of a human to another. God's love is infinitely higher. So the aim of all of this is to avoid anthropomorphism in language. Now there are some strengths and weaknesses of Aquinas' analogy here. Some strengths are that analogous language is consistent with the view held by many Christians, that God is mysterious, he's transcendent, he's partially beyond our understanding. And so the use of analogy here upholds the principle that God is the creator, that he is greater than the created. It also allows descriptions of God that are not univocal, and therefore they don't limit God's nature. They don't involve anthropomorphism, as we've said. And it allows positive statements about God, and also helps us try and make sense of complex new ideas about him. But there are some weaknesses. One is by William Blackstone, and he was an English legal scholar in the 1700s. He was also a Tory politician, and he read at Oxford University at Pembroke College, and a lot of his works, well, some of them have survived, of things that he wrote as an undergraduate, and they're quite well known for his notes and texts around the law, around politics, and some of them on religion and theology. And here, William Blackstone argued that analogous language is not useful. He disagreed that the use of analogy is helpful because the terms have to first be translated into univocal language to have any meaning, and then they get converted into analogous language afterwards. So he doesn't really believe that it deals with the problem of univocal language as Aquinas hoped. He doesn't say this, but it also can be unclear to what extent or in what way human love is analogous to God's love. And so we're left still with an ambiguity despite using analogy. Another device that is used to talk meaningfully about God is the apophatic argument, or the via negativa, the negative way. Now, this is a concept that people believe dates back as old as philosophy itself. We can find some works in Pseudo-Dionysius, who was a Greek author and Christian theologian and a Neoplatonic philosopher around the 5th or 6th century. The name pseudo is given because it's a false attribute to the Athenian convert of Paul the Apostle, which is found in the book of Acts in the Bible. And since they've discovered that the works of this Christian theologian are not in fact that person. Regardless, this is the concept, that the idea that we cannot use human language to effectively describe God as he goes beyond our human understanding of the words that we use. So instead of speaking positively about God, the via positiva, instead of speaking about what God is, we should speak about what God is not. So we cannot make positive assertions about God, but we are able to make assertions about what God is not. And that's because it's within our realm to talk about what he isn't and gain knowledge from that, rather than trying to discuss what he is when we can't have a clear grasp or concept of a transcendent being like God. Again, the aim of this is to avoid anthropomorphism, attributing human language and parts to God. One of the problems with the via negativa, however, is especially for a believer like a Christian, if you go to the Holy Scriptures, the Bible talks very positively about God. A very simple example is when it says God is love. So the via negativa seems to avoid a very Christian tradition here. Well, let's turn to symbol. This is another way of talking meaningfully about God. Physical symbols are a hugely important facet of religious life, practice, and dialogue. They are used within religions to symbolize things of a greater meaning. Let's take, for Christians, the cross as an example. Now, if we just left it at the historic understanding of the purpose of the crucifix, of the cross, it was to execute murderers and criminals during the Roman Empire. However, for Christians, it took on a far deeper spiritual meaning. From the point of Jesus' death on the cross, for Christians, the crucifix, the cross, becomes a symbol of forgiveness, of the Son of God dying for the sins of the world. There is hope in the death of Jesus. And so the cross carries a far greater meaning. The Star of David carries huge religious and cultural importance for Jews. Symbols offer a greater meaning. The scholar that we need to think about is Paul Tillich. And he emphasized the importance of symbols within religious language. He said that language is symbolic in a very specific way, and he drew a distinction between a symbol and a sign. The distinction that he makes is that a sign is a very practical necessity for communicating basic information. Take the give way sign on the road. You get to that stop sign and you know that you have to give way to another vehicle. It's very practical and it communicates basic information. A symbol, however, he argued, points to a much deeper meaning. Let's take, for example, the British flag, the flag of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This flag communicates a deep nationalistic sentiment that goes beyond simply pointing to a country. It also represents the deeper meaning of the union of countries that make up the UK. Many would take pride when they see the flag flying. Symbols, he said, have life cycles, however, and they are subject to change. He asserted that symbols participate in the things to which they point, and that's a very important thing to note down. Symbols participate in the things to which they point to. Therefore, the flag of a country will participate in the nationality in which it symbolizes. It's more than just a piece of fabric. Tillich's thoughts on symbolism are considered to be cognitive. And that's because it's reasonable to inquire and ask questions about the truth of these statements. And that's because if it's a cognitive religious statement, the person is making a claim that something is factually or literally true or false. Let's have a look then at some of the weaknesses of symbols. These are general weaknesses. They can become trivialized, and the original meaning can become lost. They may only make sense in certain communities or contexts. They're not universal. They don't necessarily transcend all contexts. They could be interpreted very differently across different contexts. For example, there is a very similar image of a swastika in the Sanatana Dharma, in the Hindu faith, whereas many people, especially in Western Europe, would see the swastika as a symbol of the terrible Nazi regime that existed. They could become the focus of worship. If you take this image here, this is a relic of the Eastern Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox Church. And this is Saint Spiridon, who was protecting the island from a plague and is seen as the saviour of the island of Corfu. I actually visited this myself last year and pondered upon the fact that queues of people were coming to kiss the slippered feet of Saint Spiridon. And here you could argue this is where a symbol of something like hope and protection has become the focus, perhaps, of some people's worship. The symbol itself could become outdated. It may no longer possess relevance, and it might need modernizing for a contemporary audience today. Now, this would somewhat fall in line with Tillich's idea that they are subject to change. John Hick, who we should be familiar with by now, aimed a criticism at Tillich. He raises the issue with the sentence that I asked you to note down, that symbols participate in the deeper meaning they point to. His argument was that it was unclear. It's not clear at all what this really means. And he also said that the distinction between signs and symbols, there's very little between them. He also went on to say that the symbol could potentially be less meaningful depending on who is using it. So what if an atheist who states the description of Jesus in the New Testament of the Bible and says, Jesus is the bread of life? The atheist is not going to clearly have the same impact as a Christian who declares Jesus is the bread of life. This symbol is likely to only have impact and meaning to the Christian who says it, not the atheist. Let's move to the second section, verification and falsification. So let's consider verification. In order to look at this, we should consider some categories of statements that get used, and it will help us with these discussions. We will already be familiar with these anyway. Analytic are statements which contain meaning and evidence within themselves. We can have examples of this in tautologies where a definition proves itself, and that would be also a priori knowledge. Synthetic statements do not contain meaning and evidence within themselves, but are related. And contingent statements could either be true or false dependent on the context in which they sit. Now this is important, in particular analytic and synthetic statements, because the verification principle in which we will look at follows that these two types of statements are necessary for something to be considered meaningful. So where did it all come from? The Vienna Circle and logical positivism. So the Vienna Circle was a group of Western European philosophers, some of which you can see here, who championed logical positivism from 1924 to 1936, when members disbanded due to World War II. And their thoughts heavily influenced a scholar that we're going to be focusing on in a moment, A.J. Ayer's verification ideas. The Vienna Circle was also made up of the likes of Schlick and Moritz, and also Wittgenstein, who we will look at also at a later point. Logical positivism, which they championed, is a philosophical idea that argues knowledge is only true if it is empirically proved. That would be using a posteriori knowledge from experience, or analytic statements, so a priori knowledge. So logical positivism deems only something to be true and meaningful if these criteria are met. It is a method of verifying statements. Now in comes Ayer and his verification principle. He started out putting forward a strong verification principle. And this was a scientific method to verify something to be meaningful or not. He initially argued that any statement in language which cannot be empirically or analytically verified becomes meaningless. In other words, it's a pointless statement. And he concluded that this therefore applies to all religious language, because it's in the realm of metaphysics, that which you can't empirically test or deem to be analytically verifiable. Now, shortly after positing this argument, he had to adapt it, and that was because he needed to address the issue of history and science, in some cases being deemed therefore meaningless. For example, if you take the strong verification principle and apply it here to the Battle of Hastings, there's a problem. You can't empirically verify that it happened because you weren't there. You weren't there to observe it. It's also not true in and of itself. It doesn't verify itself analytically. let's look at some science. A very straightforward fact that we all believe in, that water boils at 100 degrees. The problem is you can't accept the premise that all water boils at 100 degrees if you take the strong verification principle, and that's because you can't possibly empirically test every single water in the entire world and test that it boils at 100 degrees. So technically speaking, it becomes a meaningless statement. You can also take beauty. We like to look at a picture like that and say how beautiful it is. But according to Ayer's strong verification principle, if we applied it in a harsh way to something like beauty, it would be a meaningless thing to say that this is a beautiful picture, because you can't empirically verify its beauty, and by definition, it's not what beauty is. So he adapted his strong principle, and he argued two versions of it. Yes, we've got the strong version that statements have been proved in experience. But in order to deal with history and science losing its meaningfulness, he introduced weak verification, and that is, weak statements could theoretically be proven. This could be, another version is indirect, or through practical or indirect means. But the problem with this is that it did lead to some then being able to claim that religious language can now be deemed meaningful in theory. You can indirectly verify God, perhaps through his creation. This would appeal to perhaps the likes of someone like Aquinas. There were some heavy criticisms laid at the foot of A.J. Ayer on his verification principle. One of them being that empirical evidence simply can't be trusted because humans are flawed. We can't verify something truly on the basis of someone's observation. Now, with the exception of tautologies, it's impossible to make any statement of meaning. Religious statements, by either criteria, end up having no meaning whatsoever, whether they propose or deny God's existence. So even for atheists claiming there is no God, that would be a meaningless statement according to the verification principle. It would render the entire discipline of philosophy completely and utterly meaningless. How do you verify philosophy? There's a great irony and contradiction here. That logical positivism renders itself meaningless as a statement. It cannot verify itself. It also views science as the only way to find truth. And Vincent Brummer, a South African Christian theologian, argued that comparing religious and scientific statements is not really something you should do. The nature of both are two very different things. And that's perhaps where you might then lean towards alternative ways of understanding religious language, perhaps through analogy or through symbol. There are two concepts, and this is a good synoptic link with meta-ethics. Anti-realist, which is also non-cognitive language, and realist, which is also cognitive language. And you can see here the two go hand in hand. The nature of language is what we're dealing with here. And it's important to understand these two concepts when discussing religious language. An anti-realist, non-cognitivist person believes, in terms of meta-ethics, that morality is not a set of facts and isn't capable of being true or false. When we're thinking about it in terms of religious language, we should therefore be skeptical as an anti-realist or a non-cognitivist, skeptical of having the ability to understand the true nature of objective reality. It isn't something we should be able to claim to do. And when we look more closely at applying it to religious language, it would be right to say God exists, but only within a religious form of life. Therefore, it is often expressed, religious language, symbolically and equivocally when through the lens of an anti-realist or a non-cognitivist. In contrast, a realist or a cognitivist believer believes that morality, as studied in metaethics, is a set of facts and is capable of being true or false. When applying this concept to religious language, we're thinking here again about God exists. However, this time, for a realist or a cognitivist, it is an objective, factual statement that they are expressing, and they're expressing it univocally, with one meaning. This helps us when we think of scholars like John Hick. John Hick came up with the term eschatological verification. The eschaton is the study of eschatology is the study of the end things, the last days or the last things. In Christian theology, that will be looking at what happens on Judgment Day, what happens in the end times, in the afterlife. Well, John Hick came up with the idea that certain ideas, like the existence of the afterlife, can be verified following death. He said this was true of Christianity. You can verify the Christian faith when you die. You will either stand before God and verify your belief, or you won't. In doing so, he offers a parable, something which you'll become more familiar with, more parables shortly. The parable of the celestial city. He says two men are travelling on a road, and it is the only road there is, so they must travel on it together. The first traveller, traveller A, believes the road leads to a celestial city, like in that image, a type of paradise. But the second traveller, traveller B, believes the road leads nowhere, and that the journey is a meaningless pursuit of nothingness. The conclusion here is that clearly one of them is right and one of them is wrong. This is where we can apply realism or anti-realism, cognitivism or non-cognitivism to Hick. In this case, for Hick, he's being a realist, a cognitivist, because he is making the claim that you can be factually true or false about the existence of an afterlife. Eschatological verification, therefore, is a way of factually making a claim, being a realist, a cognitivist in your religious language, univocally, believing that if you say there is an afterlife or heaven is real, that it can be a factual statement because you can verify it in the afterlife. There's obviously a very obvious flaw with this, which is if it's not true, how would you know? Because you'll be dead and there will be nothing. And how can you come back and tell anybody that, in fact, you were right all along? Because you'll be also dead and here not on earth. So there are some problems with eschatological verification. Well, let's turn to the falsification principle. This is the falsification principle by Antony Flew. He was influenced by Karl Popper, who's known as the father of falsificationism. And this is very much the new scientific method. It replaces verificationism. Flew used the parable as well. and he used the parable to explain his ideas about falsification. There's an in-depth study of this parable on one of my other videos, a much lengthier detailed version of this. You can click on that link and annotate your text there. He used the parable of two explorers in a garden. It actually is a parable influenced and taken by John Wisdom's gardener parable. One believes in a gardener and the other explorer doesn't. The skeptic explorer does not believe in the gardener because there are weeds. The believing explorer chooses to ignore such facts. And that's the theme of Flu's ideas about the believer, ignoring the facts. Through this analogy, Flu argues that theists must admit that there is evidence which could disprove God, or admit that no evidence would change their minds. In Flu's parable, there are at least 3 tests to see whether there is a gardener who is there or not. The skeptical explorer lays the tests and shows each time to the believing explorer that his theory of a gardener is incorrect. Despite being presented with the facts each time, the believer chooses to offer an explanation or avoid the reality of the conclusion of each test. In this case, the believing explorer does not admit that there is evidence that disproves the gardener, and also doesn't admit that there's any evidence that would change their mind. Now, in the first option of admitting there is evidence that could disprove God, Flu argues religion could be meaningless here, but falsifiable. Now, in the first option, Flu argues religion could be meaningful, but falsifiable. That's because if you can falsify something, it's considered meaningful. This isn't, by the way, about whether you can prove something true or false as such. It's about its meaningfulness. In the second option, religion, where you're saying you admit no evidence would change their minds, religion would be false, but meaningless. And that's because there's evidence to prove that it's false, but the believer refuses to let it be falsified, and so it remains a meaningless statement to say that there is a God, or in this case, there is a gardener. And it's a challenge he lays to theists. In fact, it's a very clever trap, because there's no believer in their right mind that is going to admit you can disprove God just to make their statement meaningful. But if they then don't admit any evidence to change their minds, whatever they say becomes meaningless. Flu despairs, and here are some phrases that are taken from his text. He despairs that believers shift and move the goalposts, that they constantly change what their original assertion was. An assertion is a factual claim, that they shift the goalposts and keep changing their original belief and ideas to suit their own belief and narrative. And in doing so, they die a death 1,000 qualifications. Flu has cleverly taken this old Chinese torture method, where in ancient China they would use capital punishment by torturing somebody by cutting them in 1,000 different places, short little cuts, and they would bleed out to death slowly. And this is what Flu thinks of the believer's original claim and assertion, that they are dying a death 1,000 qualifications. Every time they seek to qualify their beliefs, they weaken their original argument. And they do this whenever they are faced with contradictory evidence. And the example of contradictory evidence that Flew uses is taken from the problem of evil. One of his examples is an inoperable child with cancer, and the way that the father holds still on to the belief that God will intervene and answer his prayer. Richard Hare responds to Antony Flew, and he responds with his own parable analogy about a madman, a student at university, who believes that all the dons, which is an Oxbridge term for professor, want to kill him. He argues that whilst the dons might not want to kill the madman, the student who's gone insane, he truly believes this to be true, no matter what his friends tell him, no matter how many people show him that these dons are not out to kill him. In fact, if anything, it strengthens the madman's beliefs further into greater conspiracy theories that the dons truly are trying to kill him. John Hick comes along and argues that the madman might be looking at the same evidence as his friends who deny the murderous motivations of the dons, but they might be interpreting it differently depending on their worldview. Hick's ideas here come from his pluralistic hypotheses. Thinking about religious experience for a moment, he considers those like blicks, because you can't truly grasp the reality of God using the human mind. Instead, you have different religious interpretations of a religious experience, but each one doesn't cancel the other out. They can all be valid insights. He uses the parable of the blind men and the elephant to make that point. Even though the blind men, the religions, might say contradictory things, their statements are not falsified. So there is a support here for Hare coming from Hick. Focusing just on that term that Hare coined, a blick, it is simply a worldview. And for Hare, he argues, because it's a worldview and it's not an assertion, that means he's not making a factual claim about God. He argues they are unfalsifiable. In other words, he says to Flew, you can't touch me because I'm not making an assertion. Therefore, there's nothing here to falsify. You can't apply your falsification principle to religious language. Perhaps this is playing into the idea that Flew has, that he's simply avoiding the test. Finally, we have Basil Mitchell's response to Flew, and this is considered to be a stronger idea, especially for believers. Considering Richard Hare was a Christian, it would be odd, really, to accept blicks from a traditional Christian point of view, because you would have to accept that eventually, in order to claim that your beliefs are meaningful, you would have to liken yourself to Hare's madman, the lunatic. And that's not something most religious people want to be associated with. Especially if you want to avoid the charge by people like Freud and Dawkins, who say that religion is a neurosis, a mental illness. Anyway, back to Mitchell. Mitchell agrees that statements about God should be assertions. They are factual claims, just like Flew believes religious people are making. And he insists that evil does count against the belief, the assertion, that God loves us. This is quite refreshing. Mitchell isn't avoiding the test. Mitchell isn't running away, it seems. His parable, the parable of the stranger and the partisan, the freedom fighter, tackles some ideas. He tackles Flew and he tackles Hare. he talks about a provisional hypothesis. Now, these are scientific ideas that are discarded the moment contradictory evidence comes along. And this is something that Flew suggests that religious people do. He also tackles vacuous formulae. And this is very much like Hare's blicks, the worldviews that simply have empty meaning. There's no substance to them. And he believes some believers talk in this way. Some believers treat the contradictory evidence and discard it. Some believers come at religious language as a blick with empty meaning, but he thinks they are a minority and they are mistaken. Turning to his parable, the believer in God, just like the believer in the stranger of Mitchell's parable, has an attitude of trust. In Mitchell's parable, the partisan meets a stranger in the night, physically meets him, and is convinced that the stranger is on his side of the resistance. But the stranger sometimes, in order not to blow his cover, seems to be working for the enemy. His friends tell the partisan, "Look, your friend, the stranger over there, is helping the enemy. How can we trust him?" And no matter what evidence is presented to the partisan, he still believes the stranger is on his side. So some things suggest that the stranger is on the side of the resistance, and this creates ambiguous evidence against him. Some things suggest that he isn't. But the partisan is moved by the encounter, and that's an important aspect. It's a type of religious experience in the parable. He encounters the stranger enough to trust that even when it seems otherwise, the stranger really is on his side. Now let's segue to discuss a religious believer who has a similar attitude of trust in God that the partisan has in the stranger. This trust is not without tension. Mitchell readily embraces the full force of the conflict, a phrase that he uses in his text. They face the full force of the conflict. But the believer is committed to not abandoning belief in the face of contradictory evidence. And that's because the believer has adopted an attitude of faith. And this is what Mitchell refers to in his text as a significant article of faith. The believer doesn't run away from the test or the contradictory evidence, faces the full force of the conflict, and because of their commitment and faith, they continue to trust in God. Flew responds to both Hare and Mitchell. His response to Hare is to criticize Blix and say that these are unorthodox for Christians. In other words, the majority of believers are more traditional than believing in a Blick. It does no justice to their faith in God. He also says Blicks are just personal worldviews and they don't assert anything proper about God, which Hare admits they're not factual claims. But where does that leave the believer? In fact, Flew goes as far as to say that Blicks make religious belief sound silly and fraudulent. It's almost as if he has more respect for Mitchell than he does Hare, because Mitchell seems to at least own his religious beliefs. Flew's response to Mitchell is that he accepts, the same as Mitchell, that religious beliefs are assertions, factual claims, but he thinks Mitchell is just playing a delay tactic here, that he's delaying the inevitable, because the falsification principle has to be answered at some point. He also believes, when analysing the parable, that it's a poor analogy. He believes the stranger has to protect his identity, but God does not need to do this because he's omniscient. He's omnipresent. So what is God's excuse when it looks as if he's on the side of the enemy, when he's not answering prayer? He believes that if relentlessly pursued, Mitchell is going to have to admit at some point that there is no God, or he's going to have to begin qualifying his beliefs, and we all know where that ends, dying a death 1,000 qualifications. And so finally we turn to language games. Language games, to start thinking about this, we need to consider how easily it is to miscommunicate with language. Miscommunication happens when using words. We can take many examples of miscommunication. One are idioms. You could state to somebody that it's raining cats and dogs. But if someone isn't familiar with that idiom, perhaps from a different culture or had never heard of it before, they might be very confused. They may start looking up, wondering if cats and dogs are truly going to rain down on them. Or they might look at you like you've gone mad. Instead of clearly understanding that what you really meant was that it's just raining very hard. So the words that people use to communicate ideas are super important as the ideas themselves. And that's because the listener might understand the words to mean something very different to the individual with whom they're speaking to. It's important to remind ourselves as well of these two ideas. Realist, cognitivist ideas are ones which express propositions, factual claims, and therefore can be said to be true or false. There are also anti-realist, non-cognitive statements where you cannot be said to be true or false, statements which are not said to be true or false. We're going to apply this to Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was an Austrian philosopher, very, very influential in philosophy, one of the greats, and heavily discussed and influenced the concept of language. He worked primarily in logic, the philosophy of maths, the mind, and language. Wittgenstein was discussed heavily at the Vienna Circle, and there was split opinion about his work as well, and he heavily influenced it. And he developed a theory called language game theory. Now, leading up to the formation of this theory, he had written a book called Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And in this book, he articulated that people communicate with pictures. So when I'm speaking to you and describing something, you are picturing, imagining in your mind what I'm telling you. However, the picture that you have in your mind may be very different to the one that I'm trying to convey. Words carry pictures. He in fact took this idea from a Parisian court case where a model of a car was used for the jury to draw their conclusions. However, whilst he'd addressed the issue of miscommunication, he later wanted to revisit this whole issue of language. And in his more influential book, Philosophical Investigations, that's where he turned his time to language game theory. In it, he argues that theists and atheists, when discussing matters of religion and God, might as well be talking different languages. He turned away from the logical positivists' focus on the meaning of words, and he considered more how the words are used. And this led him to develop an anti-realist, non-cognitive theory. Language game theory is anti-realist because he argues the meaning of words is subjective. And it's non-cognitive because he looks at the purpose of language instead of whether it was a fact. Now, he compares it to playing a game of sports. So, for example, if someone tries to play football using the rules of netball, there's going to be a huge amount of confusion. It's not the ball, but it's the context which is important. So too, it is not the word, but the context which indicates the meaning. So, believers and non-believers are both using the same words, but they are not meaning the same thing. The purpose of the language being used is different, and it's subjective. If we imagine Richard Dawkins using the word God, it would differ to what a Christian would mean when they use the word. Now, should this theory be correct, this means that theists and atheists are playing different games with different equipment. Therefore, language that's religious is meaningful, but only to those who are playing with the same rules in the same game. And it therefore becomes meaningless to anyone else. Many religious people have responded quite positively to language game theory. It actually allows them to navigate conversations within philosophy and not compromise their belief. They can't be accused of meaningless language. However, does language game theory mean that only those involved in the religion itself can discuss it meaningfully? Imagine you had an interfaith forum of different religious leaders, all talking to each other about their faith. Are we really suggesting that they're talking gobbledygook to each other, that there's confusion that reigns when they speak? Surely, if you look at the debate between Russell and Copleston, for example, the two of them seem to have a healthy radio debate about contingency, necessity, causation, and religious experience. It doesn't seem as if they're unable to talk to each other because of sheer confusion. And this concludes the topic of religious language.